Hello, and welcome to episode 12 of the Forensicsworld podcast. My name's Will Dodds. I've recently retired from a 23-year policing career, and I spent 15 of those years approximately in forensics and crime scene investigation. So, we're going to do something today I'm going to call Learn Something Sunday, and this will be part one of Learn Something Sunday. And the idea maybe is to do this fairly regularly and hopefully pass on some knowledge to anyone who's listening and interested in the topic and the discipline. So what I'm thinking is I'll cover 5 questions related to random forensics and crime scene related topics, and I'll include an answer or response to those questions. And the questions sourced or being coming from listeners and followers from the Instagram account and various other social media platforms of Forensics World. So let's get started. Question number 1. When does the human decomposition process begin? Well, that's pretty easy. Immediately upon death. So there's no delay, there's no 15 minutes after death or when the body cools or an hour later or once lividity starts to present itself. No, it's immediate because immediately upon death, circulation stops, oxygenation of the body's system stops, and the decay process begins. And yeah, certainly it might take minutes to hours before things become really obvious, but the process starts immediately upon death. Another question. Question number 2. What is ninhydrin and what is it used for? Well, ninhydrin is a chemical that is put together using other chemicals. You can make it yourself, but it's best and most conveniently bought as ninhydrin. And it is used in processing fingerprints or searching for latent fingerprints in porous type materials such as paper. You can use ninhydrin on maybe less glossy cardboard or cardboard that doesn't have that glossy feature to it or glossy covering to it. You can use ninhydrin in wood. Any porous type material will react with ninhydrin. The matrix that is presented by the impression will react with ninhydrin, and it'll come up a purplish color actually. So what ninhydrin does, the process would be to soak the item in the ninhydrin and then let it dry. So for instance, if you're doing a piece of paper, you would take that paper or a document, you would soak it in ninhydrin till it's, completely soaked, and then you could hang it to dry. And once it dries, you can start to see the impressions will begin to show themselves. And interestingly enough, you can get a surprisingly good amount of friction ridge detail from an ninhydrin print. And you may just have to be mindful. It's maybe a little spotty, maybe not beautifully consistent, but you can definitely catch and trace the friction ridges in many cases. Something to keep in mind with ninhydrin as well is that the overnight or the 24 hours after the first dip and dry, you will get a result. But don't leave it at that. Have a look, revisit your paper, because quite often 24 hours later, so 48 hours in, you're going to see even further development of those impressions. Now, I've seen it where even after a couple of days, if your first thought is, oh, there's nothing there, or it's just not going to come up enough to make any sort of an identification. Well, in fact, 2 days later, 3 days later, there was something there. So ninhydrin, it's a very commonly used chemical and helps in that search of latent impressions. And don't um, just put your exhibit away after a day. Give it a few days before you make your final decision on what will be useful or not. Next question. What are the 3 parts of the exposure triangle in photography? So the exposure triangle in photography is basically the 3 big ones in regards to photography. There's aperture, there's ISO, and there's shutter speed. So aperture is when you is the opening which allows light to be presented to the well, back before was older times where maybe in film you can still get film, you can still do some film photography, but in typically for digital photography now, it's amount of light being exposed to the photo sensor that will then um, convert that light and what's been brought into the camera into an image. Now, as you adjust the aperture, it adjusts the amount of light being permitted into the camera. And aperture is measured in f-stops from f 2.5 or a very low number, which is actually a very large aperture opening, to as high as f22 or approximately about that level, where the aperture is very tight and not allowing a lot of light to get through. So the second part of the exposure triangle is ISO, and that's the sensitivity of the sensitivity to light of the processor. And when the ISO is increased, the sensitivity to light is increased. So in a lower light situation, you will get a brighter photo. If you take your ISO too high into sort of the thousands, is the 865, 6, 7, 8,000, you end up getting potentially something called artifacts on your photo, which almost looks like a bit of quasi distortion. Going the other way, if your ISO is too low, your sensitivity to light becomes very low, and your impression and your image will be a little darker and probably not exactly what you're looking for. So that's ISO. And the last one of the last one of the exposure triangle, it would be shutter speed. And the shutter speed is simply the amount of time that the aperture is open to receive the light. So as your as your shutter speed goes down, your amount of light coming into your camera increases. So the speed of the shutter is slower, thus the aperture remains open longer. These 3 factors, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, work in conjunction with each other in order to try and create the best photograph possible. Now, I typically shot with my camera an aperture priority, which allowed me to play around with my aperture manually, and then the camera would then adjust the shutter speed accordingly to the environment it sensed when it was exposed to the image or what I was shooting. ISO, I would adjust that. I usually shot maybe around 2000. It just depended on the situation. And depending upon your artistic desires or your your want to having more and more control over your photographs, you can go to full manual where you're adjusting the ISO, aperture, and shutter speed yourself. Other end of the scale, you could go to what in Nikon is called program mode, where the ISO, aperture, and shutter speed are all adjusted automatically by the camera. Now, that doesn't always give you the photograph that you want. I don't want to get into it too much right now, but aperture control does play a factor in something called depth of field. So photography, I mean, it's the bread and butter of forensics in my mind. I've taken thousands and thousands of photographs, and most of which, in fact, 95% probably were on aperture priority. And you get to know the three parts of the triangle. You get to understand what they do. And once you reach that comfort level, you're going to be able to create amazing photographs under basically any conditions that you come across. So get familiar with those three factors. Another question. So you have a bloody t-shirt. Should you let that bloody t-shirt dry before taking a DNA sample? Do you have to let the t-shirt dry before you take your DNA sample? So think of a t-shirt from a stabbing victim. You've seized the item, you've seized the t-shirt, you've brought it back to the office, and you have to collect a DNA sample. Well, if you collect that DNA sample when the blood still is wet or the shirt still is wet, that's fine. You can swab that, no problem. You could also hang that t-shirt to dry in the drying rack or in your drying cabinet and wait until there's no more wet blood or it is completely dry. And you can sample uh, the dried blood. Now, how you would do that with a swab would be you'd be using the wet swab technique where you put a little distilled water onto a swab and then you um, uh, bring that swab in contact with the t-shirt or the bloody portion of the t-shirt and you're collecting a DNA sample. When you think about it, you're collecting whether the t-shirt is dry or whether the t-shirt is wet, you're still collecting a wet sample in a sense. Because when you're taking a DNA sample of blood from the bloody t-shirt of before it dries, you're using the dry swab technique where the dry swab is used to take the blood sample directly from the t-shirt. When it's dry, you're using the wet swab technique where you're putting a wet swab onto the blood in order to collect it. So in the end, does either affect the quality of the DNA sample? Absolutely not. Can you collect a DNA sample from a bloody wet t-shirt? Sure. Can you collect a DNA sample from a dried bloody t-shirt? Sure, no problem. And ultimately, you're going to be drying that t-shirt anyways because it's going to be in your drying cabinet. Because for storage purposes, you want to make sure that there is no wet blood, and thus the blood doesn't rot or end up ruining. So either way is fine. And ultimately, you certainly want to dry that t-shirt and store it with no wet blood on it. All right, we'll just do one more question here for our Learn Something Sunday Part 1. What is the best way to store seized footwear? Now, when you think of the choices, you've got just put them on a shelf, no bag. Another choice, you could use a plastic bag and seal them in a plastic bag. Or you could put these shoes into a paper bag and then you staple the bag shut or something like that and use evidence tape. Every time use the paper bag. What you do not want to do is put shoes into a plastic bag. Now, okay, if they're brand new, never been worn, sure, you could put them in a plastic bag, but err on the side of caution. You just don't know where shoes have been. Put them in a paper bag and then label them properly and store them in your evidence room or evidence locker, however you take care of your evidence. Paper bag allows moisture to escape. It allows the evidence to breathe. It prevents rot. It prevents destruction of the evidence by allowing it, giving it a proper means to dry out. So use a paper bag. Certainly, if someone has stuck shoes in a plastic bag, no problem. Just get them from the scene back to the office, get them out of that plastic bag, and put them in a paper bag. When in doubt, paper bag. When in doubt with basically anything, paper bag. If you have to double the paper bag, triple the paper bag, that's fine too. But in this case, in regards to footwear, seized footwear, use the paper bag every time. All right, so that's going to conclude Learn Something Sunday. We've got 5 questions that were sent in. They're great questions, really appreciated. I'd like to invite anyone who does have a question to send it in to Forensics World as a DM, preferably on the Instagram feed, and it's really easy to read that and identify the questions that we're going to cover on part 2, Learn Something Sunday. We'll see how that all goes. Anyways, thanks so much for listening, and I really appreciate it. And looking ahead a little bit, I've got some plans for our first podcast with a guest. Very excited about that. And I've also got plans to do a podcast discussing the discovery of the skeletal remains that I've done a few posts on the Instagram feed about. So that's going to be a very interesting one as well. So find us, follow Forensics World on Spotify, on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts. You can follow Forensics World on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, X, Threads, etc. We got it everywhere. So remember our theme on this Learn Something Sunday, learn something today. Thanks for listening, and until next time.